Soren Kierkegaard lived from 1813 till 1855. One may argue whether he was a philosopher or a Christian theologian, but he was certainly a theist, and specifically a Christian theist occupied with questions concerning man's existence. He is also widely considered the first existential author. His authorship may dwell on despair and guilt, but the key word for Kierkegaard is joy. He worshipped everyday life even though he was never able to enjoy it himself. He did, however, spend his entire authorship identifying the conditions for living an authentic and joyful life in accordance with oneself and God. Kierkegaard's life was not marked by many dramatic events, but the disastrous engagement with the 17-year-old Regina Olsen is central in the understanding of Kierkegaard. The 10 years older Kierkegaard had expended all his charms to force an engagement through, only to instantly realize that he was incapable of going through with the engagement. Following a year's agony, he forced her to call it off in the brutest of manners, and it was the scandal of the town. He never forgave himself the affair that plays an integral part of his authorship, but it also made him one of the great philosophers and one of the few that really broke new grounds. Another very dramatic incident in Kierkegaard's life was the so-called church storm that took place in the last years of Kierkegaard's life. Kierkegaard was wary of the democratic reforms in Denmark in the mid-19th century because he feared that in a democratic society that individual would disappear. That is, the idea that a man, the individual, in order to function properly in a society, must first find himself. But democracies do not appeal to that individual, but to the masses. And Kierkegaard had the deepest mistrust of man when he becomes part of a mass. As part of a mass, the IQ level plummets, but what is even worse is that man as part of a mass never really takes personal responsibility. Everybody just goes with the crowd, and a democracy will therefore be a tyranny far worse than any kingdom. Kierkegaard blamed the church that it had joined the masses in their cries for democratic reform instead of calling to order and tearing the masses apart. Kierkegaard also blamed the church its preaching of Christianity. Kierkegaard is in doubt as to how the two roles of Jesus relate to each other. On the one hand, there are no limits to the kindness of Jesus, while on the other hand, there are no boundaries to his rigor. But perhaps Kierkegaard concludes the answer is that Christianity lives in the tension between the two ultimate demands. Therefore, he argues, it represents a destruction of Christianity if one exclusively refers to the one, and Kierkegaard became increasingly convinced that this is what the church did. It had forgotten the rigor of Christianity and distorted Christianity into a soft and cuddly sentimentality. All these disagreements gave rise to the prolific church storm that consumed the last 7 years of Kierkegaard's life. It also raises question whether Kierkegaard changed his mind on some of his central tenets, but in the midst of the turmoil, he collapsed on the street and died at the hospital in November 11th, 1855. Kierkegaard takes patience and effort to read. But if you take the time, he is a treasure house of positive outlook, regardless of whether you believe in God or not. Especially his ideas about choosing oneself, to value attitude over feelings, and finding eternity in every moment offers lots of inspiration. But more than anything, perhaps his idea that life's darkest and most challenging and troubling moments are also the best moments for growing as a person can offer solitude and hope if and when life is weighing you down. I hope this video series will entice your interest in him and encourage you to delve right into his works, preferably with some companion readers. They can help you a great deal before you really get the hang of him and let himself challenge and possibly change you. I hope you will enjoy this series. It is a condition for man, says Kierkegaard, that while he is born as a man, that only means that he is born with the possibility of becoming a man. man's immediately given reality is a lost reality, and one only becomes a man when one has identified oneself with the specific abilities and environmental circumstances one is beforehand and have made them one's own. If a person does not undertake this process of realization, the self will not materialize. Instead, man will lose himself into all that he immediately is and become a mindless cog in a machinery, internal as external, destined to function in the manner of the machinery forces him to. Kierkegaard calls this person the Philistine. The Philistine is a product of what his surroundings and culture will make of a person with his talents and dispositions. Hence, the Philistine lives in despair, says Kierkegaard, since his life is not dependent on himself, but on conditions outside himself that he is a mere slave to. If the Philistine wants to break with his fundamental despair, he must strive to become an ethical person and then onwards to the religious existence. First, however, he must pass through the aesthetic stage. A Philistine is always a Philistine without knowing he is a Philistine. But what happens when he discovers the self-deceit? Well, now he really despairs, because now he no longer despairs over something specific, but because he discovers that in essence he has always been living in despair. All he has been doing is running a program, so to speak, without ever taking charge of himself and his life. If the Philistine cannot shake off this unsettling mood, he becomes an ascetic. This is a difficult concept, but it may loosely be defined as uninterested enjoyment. That is a state of mind where one takes pleasure without being soothed to expend any energy. Aesthetics are always on the lookout for passion, but on principle never engage themselves. Like Don Juan always looking for the next woman to seduce, they remain intentionally uninterested and liken life to a theatrical play, a farce, a grotesque and absurd drama with no coherence or meaning. For an aesthetic, it is logically impossible to make a decision, since nothing matters and everything leads to the same. That is why one of Kierkegaard's aesthetic characters in his debut novel, Either Or, can say, "Marry and you will regret it. Do not marry and you will regret it. Whether you marry or you do not marry, you will regret both." In order to make the transition from the aesthetic to the ethical, one must not live in despair, one must choose despair. This can sound counterintuitive. If I am a bit lazy and I want to be more energetic, should I not choose to be more energetic? If you think this way, then you have not understood what to choose means. To choose is to will, and when one chooses oneself, when one wills oneself exactly as one is, it has consequences. Consider an alcoholic. He is in deep despair and would more than anything like to choose himself as one that is not an alcoholic. But then he can only become identical with himself once he has overcome his alcoholism. His struggling against alcoholism will become desperate, and if he fails, he will break completely down, since it is his very self he has lost. If instead he chooses himself as an alcoholic, he is identical with himself also when he drinks. He can still try to quit his alcoholism, but he no longer tries so desperately, and if he relapses, he won't despair because he's reconciled with himself, also in his misery. To exist in this manner, reconciled with oneself because one fully and completely have said yes to oneself, that is, in Kierkegaard's view, the road to a sound mental health. But it is more than that. It is fulfillment of the ethical demand and the only manner in which responsibility can come about. For Kierkegaard, the act of choosing turns everyday life into a joyful duty. Duty may sound boring, but let's consider love in this light. The aesthetic loves for his own sake. He loves what the beloved can do to or for him. The ethical, on the other hand, lusts for the beloved's own sake. For the ethical, the idea of love is not what he can receive, but what he can give. It's important to emphasize that this understanding of love takes nothing away of the beauty in love. To the contrary, an ethical love is always young and new because it does not depend on a feeling but is based on an attitude. And feelings can be deceitful while the attitude remains firm. Kierkegaard poses the question, is it possible to repeat? That is, to take up life again even if one's world has been shaken to the core. To answer this question, Kierkegaard analyzes the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis that is commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. For Abraham, the command amounts to a complete break with everything that is ethical. In reality, it is not just Isaac he kills all meaning, rationality, and coherence in this world. Abraham's world then can only be saved if one can point to a purpose that can justify breaking an ethical demand. Kierkegaard calls this a teleological suspension of the ethical. But what purpose could possibly suspend an ethical demand? Only a religious purpose can do that. Only God can suspend an ethical demand. But this raises a new question. Is it possible to live an authentic life in unity with the ethically ordered society if God and the religious can suspend the ethical? Yes, it is possible, says Kierkegaard. The key word is faith. Faith entails that Abraham first resigns indefinitely. When God demands Isaac of him, he bows to the demand of God without hesitation, gives up Isaac and resigns indefinitely on him. But right after, Abraham performs the opposite movement. He believes. And in his faith, Abraham receives not only Isaac back, but the entire meaning of existence. Kierkegaard's fictitious writer, Johannes de Silentio, that makes the analysis, admits that he doesn't understand it, but rationally he can determine that faith is only faith when it is faith by virtue of the absurd. Faith lies beyond rationality and common sense. Faith is what takes over when common sense has reached its limits. Otherwise, it would not be faith. In other words, there is no rationality in faith. We hope in God, and God is the unfathomable from whom we can expect the unexpectable. And hereby the religious has been established as a new, higher, separate dimension in existence. But then the question is, how does one go from the ethical to the religious? That's the topic of the next video. According to Soren Kierkegaard, living religiously implies a duality. One must simultaneously live in a religious relationship with the world and in a religious relationship with God. Living religiously in relation to the world is to choose oneself and actualize one's being as the unity of individual and society. Or to put it in plainer terms, you must choose and will what you are, where you are. The relationship with God is of a completely different nature. The religious is a new passion, faith by virtue of the absurd, the infinite love unto God as sheer possibility. And here it is again, passion, the central aspect in existence. For the aesthetic person, the passion was everywhere and nowhere. For the ethical person, it was directed at his fellow man. But for the religious person, passion has found its final object, God. And how is this expressed then? Well, it cannot take any concrete form, but it shows constantly in the way man relates to the world. That's the point. The content of one's existence hasn't changed the slightest, but one's attitude towards that content is radically new, and it is in this change the religious is expressed. The religious person receives every second of life as an infinite gift and lives in a never-ending marvel of the wonder that is life. This does not mean that the religious will make all your worries and suffering disappear, but it will offer you a new attitude towards the tribulations. Life, such as it is now for me, has been given to me by God, and therefore the verdict is that it is absolutely and unmodified good. Without the religious point of view, all happenings in life are essentially mean, because we are lost to them, a plaything of their randomness, volatility, and uncertainty. But by the relationship between faith and God, they all become good, since they all flow from the Father of light, as Kierkegaard says.